Sir Peter Strawson is guest discussant in this session about events and the logical form of action sentences. While Tim Crane and Jennifer Hornsby examine closely certain aspects of these topics in two other programs in this series, this discussion constitutes an entirely self-contained appraisal of Davidson's work in these areas. The session opens with a challenge from Strawson. He proposes that his own criterion for individuating events is just as good as Davidson's criterion, and he challenges Davidson to give reasons for preferring one over the other. Davidson concedes that there are no general reasons for preferring one to the other, and argues that the appropriateness of a criterion for individuation will vary with circumstance. This leads Davidson to comment that the search for a general criterion for individuation, while interesting, is perhaps not very important. The discussion next turns to the analysis of action sentences. Strawson does not dispute Davidson's view that to find what he calls the logical form of such sentences, we should construe them as involving quantification over particular events. Instead, Strawson questions Davidson's interest in logical form. Given that the interest in analyzing action sentences devolves from a concern to show how certain inferences in which they figure are valid, Strawson offers a proposal for showing how this interest can be met merely by looking at the surface form of action sentences. Although Davidson sees some merit in this proposal, he argues that there are still some phenomena involving action sentences which it cannot explain, and he presents why his own account is preferable in this respect. The session ends with a discussion of the ontological relation between events and enduring substances. While the two philosophers agree on much of this relation, a salient difference remains. Davidson views causation to be a relation that obtains only between events, whereas Strawson is convinced that other things may stand in that relation. Finally, a question from Fraser McBride invites Davidson to respond to criticisms of his use of the slingshot argument in demonstrating that caused is not a sentential connective. McBride's question was recorded at another session and has been added to this session, where it provides an appropriate corollary to the discussion with Strawson. This program was recorded before an invited audience, and subsequent questions are from Martin Davies from Oxford University and Mark Sainsbury from King's College, University of London. We now join the discussion at the London School of Economics.
Deny to events the status of a genuine individual particular.
It's my great pleasure to welcome this afternoon a philosopher who is no stranger to the discussion of metaphysical concepts. With his own groundbreaking work, he has dominated the discussion for many years. I'm referring to Professor Sir Peter Strawson, Emeritus Professor at Oxford University. And he's agreed to join us today to talk about events. So, Professor Strawson, please.
Hello, Peter. Hello. Well, before I raise any possible debatable question, I'd like to begin by saying it's never been my intention to deny to events the status of genuine individual particulars, nor indeed to question their major importance in our ontology. Well, that said, now to some questions. First, I'd like to raise the question of individuation of events and to put to Donald a suggestion which he may or may not agree with. The individuation of events, this has two important aspects, that of, though closely connected, that of the identification of particular events, and secondly, the general criteria of identity for events. Now, it does seem to me, at any rate, that events are like substances in this respect, individual substances, that they typically fall under sortal concepts, by which I mean concepts of sorts or kinds such that no particular event can share of a given sort can share exactly the same spatio-temporal location as another event of that sort, provided, of course, that the spatio-temporal location, the place and the time, are specified in sufficient detail. And indeed, that the sort is specified sufficiently. So if I'm right in this, then specifying adequately the sort or kind, the sort of concept under which the event falls, and in sufficient detail its place and time, is sufficient to individuate, to pick out the particular event in question. So that's so much for identification. And by the same token, this supplies a general criterion of identity. Thus, same sort, same place and time, guarantees and is guaranteed by same event. Now, as a writer to that, I must add that, of course, Donald's own criterion, sameness of causes and effects, guarantees and is guaranteed by sameness of event, is equally valid. Indeed, both his criterion and mine seem to follow from the general nature of identity. X and Y are identical if and only if whatever is true of X is true of Y, and conversely. So, in this respect, the two criteria are on an equal footing. So the only question remaining is which might be practically the more useful. And it does seem to be possibly the case, I'm not dogmatic about this, that establishing sort and spatio-temporal location might in practice be easier, establishing a sameness of these for different descriptions of an event, might be easier than establishing sameness of causes and effects. But this is not a matter on which I have strong views. Donald.
Well, unfortunately, neither do I. I think I was aware that I was fishing around, trying to think of ways of individuating events, and I realized that there are things you want to do, well, let's say count, where you have to have a sortal going along before it makes any sense. To say how many watts is like how many objects. You have to say what sort of object you have in mind. I found the idea that the location in the causal nexus as an individuating principle an interesting one, just because it seemed to be different from the ones we use for objects, but difficulties certainly arise if you try to use it. I guess I was, what inspired the idea at all, aside from the sort of Kantian tone of it, which I liked, what encouraged it was perhaps a rather not enough excuse for the conclusion. I was thinking, how would we set about identifying some physiological event in the brain with having some mental activity, remembering something. And I remembered having seen a book, which I could have bought for 50 cents in a secondhand bookstore, and I've always regretted that I didn't. In the frontispiece, it had a color photograph of the top of somebody's brain. And some surgeon had cut the skull and folded back a considerable part of the skull. All of this on a person who was completely conscious. I'll just tell you, this apparently doesn't hurt. There are not many nerve endings there. And then they had poked an electrode into various parts of the brain and give a very tiny electrical shock. And then the person would say something or do something, and then they would drop a small paper letter on that part of the brain to keep track of where what happened. And there were extraordinary things. Say, you poke here, and the person suddenly forgets the names of all rivers. What? So I thought, well, what? How are we sort of trying to identify the physical event with the mental event? Well, they're both caused by poking the electrode there. Poke it in another place, and the person remembers a nursery rhyme that they didn't even know they knew, but which went back to age 2. Other astonishing things like this. Don't take this as serious science because I have no idea what is true. This is what I read there, but I think something like it. There is some truth to this sort of thing. Memories are, in some cases anyway, stored in quite specific spots. Sometimes I wish I could open my skull and put the electrode in the right place. It's all there, I just can't get at it. Then Quine suggested that a better criterion was just spatio-temporal location, which he thought does both for objects and for events. And I confess I can't see anything wrong with saying that. And Quine's next thing is to say, so what's the difference between objects and events? And there I think the answer is not, I mean, if we accept this same criterion in both cases, then the answer isn't in the principles of individuation. The difference is in the kinds and in the kind of metaphysical position that these two notions occupy in our common sense scheme of things. And there it does seem different. Objects persist in a way that events don't. I mean, we re-identify objects in certainly a very different way than we re-identify events. Most events we can't re-identify because they just occur and that's the end of them. But I suppose we in cases of certain kinds of events like a tennis match, we have some criteria for saying, yeah, this is the same tennis match as was on court 4 before it started to rain, but now it's on court 7. And that seems to involve, of course, the objects that are participating in the event. So I'm afraid I haven't got an argument here to disagree with what you're saying, Peter. In fact, we individuate all of these things in lots of different ways depending on what's convenient. The search for a general criterion is an interesting one. I'm not sure what role it plays in our practice.
Good. May I move on to something slightly different? Good.
Be my guest.
Well, now I'd like to raise a question, indeed a doubt, about Donald's proposal about what I would call perhaps the semantically significant structure of sentences reporting actions or events, and what he calls the logical form of those sentences. And I'm very much inclined to agree, indeed I scarcely couldn't, that if we understand logical form in just the way in which Donald understands it, it would be impossible to improve on his proposal for construing such sentences as quantifying over particular events or actions. What I'm not quite so convinced of is the necessity for this proposal. For it seems to me that such sentences do exhibit a structural, what you might call a logical structure, if you like, or at least a semantic syntactic structure, a logical structure, which is sufficient in itself to validate the inferences which he appeals to logical form as he understands it to show the validity of. I think that well, to expand a bit, anybody at all who masters the language knows that it's perfectly in order to add to any affirmative action or happening sentence qualifications of time, place, manner, means, and so on ad libitum. And anybody who understands this knows by the same token that it's equally in order to drop those qualifications from any affirmative sentence reporting actions and events without threat to truth value, if truth is there in the first place. This seems to me perfectly okay as it stands on the surface grammar of English without reconstructing it in logical form as Donald understands it. And there's a more general point here that it doesn't seem to me you can possibly rule out a priori the possibility of syntactic, semantic structures of an inference validating kind which don't happen to be codified in standard formal logic. And if that is so, then the inferences are okay as they stand. That's one point, that the things are okay as they stand, so the recasting, ingenious and indeed elegant as it undoubtedly is, isn't really necessary for explaining the validity of the inferences. And what's more, and perhaps more seriously, it doesn't seem to me to be realistic if the aim is to explain our understanding of what in an old-fashioned phrase we might call the logical syntax of our language. It seems to be unrealistic and in this sense, since it's obviously implausible to credit the ordinary person who perfectly well understands the validity of the inferences in question, to credit him with a grasp of, the possibility of paraphrase into ordinary predicate calculus form. And so that's why I have some hesitation about wholehearted acceptance of Donald's proposal, much as I admire it.
Well, I agree with a lot of that. Certainly, the inferences are valid as they stand. We all know that, and if we understand the sentences, we don't need a logician or anybody else to tell us that they're valid inferences. If we understand the sentences, we know that they're valid. That, in fact, those are the data with which I start, and I'm not crediting people who know all that and do it right. I'm not crediting them with any knowledge of deep structure, logical form, or even quantification theory, if that means being able to set it out, explain it, or show why these inferences, which surely are valid, why they're valid. It'd be, there are lots of much simpler inferences where, although most people wouldn't know even what to say if you said, well, why do you think that's a valid inference? They'd just know it was. We can certainly explain those by appeal to truth tables and things like that. And in fact, sometimes that's a help in the trivial sense that we can figure out whether certain inferences are valid or not, where intuition didn't do so well, where it fell into trouble. I see this talk about the logical form of these sentences as just a matter of seeing whether we can work these sentences into a form where we can prove, in fact, that the inferences are valid. Not just appreciate it, which is where we started, but understand a little better what has to be going on, so to speak, in order to validate these inferences. And it's not enough just to point out what the syntactical rules are. The syntax isn't enough. We do know that given an adverbial modifier, in a lot of cases, not quite all, we can simply drop it and get another true sentence. And those were the cases I was concerned with. We know that's a piece of syntax. Now, why is that? Does that lead from truths to truths? It does. Let's see if we can assign semantic roles to the parts of the sentences so that it falls out from that if one is true, the other is true. I don't see why everybody has to be interested in that. I was interested in it. And it seems to me, in this particular case, it pulls a lot of phenomena together, which otherwise look not easy to see through them and not easy to see how they're related to each other. We have all kinds of singular terms or descriptions for events. We name them. We give them names. The Second World War and so forth. We count them, given appropriate sorts, just as we do objects. We, in our idiom, quantify over events. We use pronomial references back to them. The very thing that Quine was talking about as one of the signs of ontification. We are often a bit confused about what to make of statements of causality if we don't appreciate the difference between particular events and types of events. All you have to do is to read Hume or John Stuart Mill to see that they really weren't clear about that distinction. It's some help to get clear about it. The fact, for example, very, very elementary, that John kissed Susan doesn't impute singularity. If it happened once, it's true. If it happened 17 times, it's true. It just says there exists at least one event of a certain sort. If you're not allowed to work it around into that form, the question whether it's talking about a particular event or is rather saying there's an event of a certain sort is lost to us. And it seems to me a lot of sentences about causality become much clearer. I see a real analogy between what I would say about singular causal statements, the eruption caused the destruction of Pompeii or something like that. An analogy between my treatment of that and Frege's treatment of the apparent sentential connectives before and after. You have a problem about them unless you take there to be quantification over events, over times. You can treat causality the same way. It seems to be a sentential connective in a lot of cases, but if you see it rather as just a two-place relation between events, just as Frege saw before and after as a two-place relation between times, you've made some progress. Just in sorting out how to think about causality, how to think about time, and so forth. But there's nothing that compels us to do this. logical form just helps clarify certain sorts of issues, and if you don't care about those issues, you don't need to worry about this.
Good. Yes, I see, obviously, the great advantage is being able to, and in practice doing, quantification over particular events. My only plea was for recognition of what could be called a structural or formal type of relation, validated relation, which isn't itself in the codified forms of standard logic, that's all. And I still think that's true. There is such a form, and we are familiar with it and recognize it in practice. So I don't want to dispute anything you've said, only make this modest plea of what I think is there in the language as regards that point.
And the point is, if we understand these sentences, we recognize that it's valid to go from this to that.
And what's more, ordinary grammar supplies a name for this particular form, namely adverbial modification.
Yes,
So
yes, it provides a name. We have adjectival modification too.
As well, yes.
And even you, I think, accept that.
We could represent that also, and usefully, in the notation.
Right.
Without doing so much, well, I won't say violence, but altering our ordinary usage so much.
Yeah.
To come back to my original remarks about not wishing for a moment to deny the status of individual particular events or objects to events. It's true, I must confess, that earlier on in my career, in the 50s or so, I claimed ontological priority for enduring, continuant particulars, space-occupying, namely substances. And by implication may seem to have deny this comparable status to particular events. And I have to concede that in this respect, I think, at least I exaggerated. And I think this partly for reasons that Donald gives, namely that we certainly refer identifyingly to, we certainly identify particular enduring substances by reference to particular events, at least as naturally, frequently, and usefully as conversely identifying particular events by reference to particular individual substances. So I concede an exaggeration in that respect and would now put events along with substances, as Aristotle calls them, and I call them primary substances, in the top class of regards ontological
Oh, I'm
biology.
delighted to hear it.
However, I'd like to add a plea in mitigation, as it were, which is, I think, this, that it seems pretty clear that our actual concept of a unified spatio-temporal system in which every particular, of what every category has its place, does absolutely depend on our recognition of the originally favoured category, that's to say, relatively enduring, continuant, substantial, space-occupying particulars in traceable relations with each other. And without that, we couldn't have this system which supplies us with means of identification, fundamentally, of every particular whatever. So that is my plea in mitigation of what was originally a little restrictive, namely.
Yeah. But I think what you say now is absolutely right. And we certainly would have no, in our ordinary talk and ways of thinking of things, I'm not talking about quantum mechanics or something like that. We wouldn't have any use for the notion of an event if we didn't have ordinary objects. And our ways of keeping track of them, re-identifying them, and all that. And many of the things that we say about that don't apply to events.
By themselves, they couldn't supply a system.
No, I agree completely. And they're different. I mean, events and objects, as we normally treat them, play different roles, but they're interdependent.
Absolutely, that's what
I mean, one of the things that you haven't mentioned that I think you agree with it, neither could we keep track of physical objects as being the same ones if we didn't know what their causal properties were.
Right. Profoundly, I agree.
What events they can sustain and still be the same object.
Yeah. That's a point which Locke made long ago, quite correct.
Good for him. I keep saying this.
Yes. Good. Well, we seem to have reached something like agreement.
I'm afraid so. No, I'm really delighted.
Now, on causal relations, you, it seems to me, show a taste for events as the terms of causal relations, and of course they are prominently, perhaps predominantly, the terms of causal relations. But I think, and I'm sure, at least I hope you would agree, that they're not exclusively the terms of causal relations. States and conditions and even non-events or absences and so on can all equally serve as terms of causal relations. For example, things like the absence of the president caused general embarrassment, or the failure of the chairman to arrive caused the proceedings to start, caused a delay in the start of the proceedings, things like that. Or even simply his fatigue, his tiredness caused deficiency of judgment, and so on. I mean, plenty of states, conditions, absences, non-occurrences, which solely count as causes and perhaps effects from each other.
Yes, because the notion of cause as we normally use it, it is a category of explanation
As well, yes.
And lots of explanations, which are in some rough sense causal, don't emphasize some change that preceded a change, because that might be obvious. And we say, well, what caused it was the presence of an inflammable gas. Well, of course, that wouldn't have caused the explosion if it hadn't been for something that lit it up. But we might already know that. And what we wonder is, why did just lighting a match cause the place to blow up? Well, because it was full of gas vapor. That's a state or something like that. Now, of course, almost anything will count as a cause. In fact, we even use sort of causal talk sometimes about why some number is the solution to some equation. And that's obviously not cause in the same sense that it holds between events. And it's a question whether event causality, causal relations between particular events, has some sort of primacy. Certainly as we get into science, it does, but it seems to me not in our ordinary talk, because when we talk about causes, we want to know why it happened, and that means supplying what we didn't know, or what's salient in one of many possible respects.
Yes. But although I agree that obviously the mere presence of a condition like inflammable gas needs to be supplemented by something happening to set off the explosion. In cases like the absence of the president caused general embarrassment, then it's more difficult unless you...
It's true, yeah, you have to tell more of a story.
Unless you think, well, it's people noticing which are events of the absence, or something like that.
Well, that would be part of the causal
story
chain, all right, but of course, well, I mean, obviously something something caused that state of affairs, but it only caused surprise because people were expecting something.
Yes. So disappointment factor, yes. Yeah.
But I have also some troubles about actions, which are just matters of not having done anything. Some abstaining.
Yes.
There's a vote being taken to abstain.
Unresponsiveness caused raised eyebrows.
Yeah. Well, it's also doing something.
Being unresponsive?
Yes. Well, unresponsible. It's refraining from voting is, if you did it intentionally, which you probably did. In fact, abstaining maybe has to be. It is certainly a candidate for an action, and yet it doesn't seem to involve doing anything.
Refraining.
What did you do for that hour? I stood still. But that's hard work, actually.
I refrain from making any comment. Hard to construe that as an action.
Maybe. I'd be glad if that were true. I mean, people are constantly asking me about these motionless refrainings, abstainings, and so forth.
The first question is to do with sort of a slightly technical nature, is to do with the role of the slingshot in your arguments concerning causation. You use the slingshot to show that causes cannot be a sentence connective, and you use that as part of an argument for your claim that in fact causes is a two-place extensional connective within a predicate connective. Now, a lot of criticisms have been made of the slingshot argument, and there's a particular line of Russellian criticism which comes originally from Smullian, I think, which has now reached the point of being sort of a modern dogma. I mean, your slingshot argument is repeated in logic books, and people show how so you make certain assumptions about this definite descriptions being singular terms, how definite descriptions interact differently with scope than names do, and consequently the slingshot doesn't have the effect that you take it to do. I wonder what your response to those lines of arguments are, or whether you think that the slingshot doesn't play such an important role in your arguments after all.
Well, all the slingshot argument shows, at best, is that it's, well, let's say it does show that if you're committed to extensionality in a certain sense, then the argument is a good one. So the question really is, are you committed to it? And of course, the slingshot argument can't by itself convince you that you're committed to extensionality. So that has to come from somewhere else. And I did argue for it, just from substitutions that we seem to be perfectly easy with, that seem to show that a lot of our talk about causality is extensional. And if you accept that, then the slingshot seems to have force. Now, Stephen Neal has recently sort of gone into the details of the slingshot to an extent that I never did. He has pointed out very clearly that it can't be an argument for extensionality. It's an argument for not accepting certain things as non-truth functional sentential connectives, given that you make some other assumptions before that. So it's a perfectly good argument against postulating facts in any interesting way to correspond to sentences and explain their truth, because there you're committed to extensionality to begin with, so to speak. But whether it applies in the case of causality and several other similar related cases. It depends on how good your reasons are for being committed to begin with, to taking singular terms or description in an extensional way. And Stephen Neal has brought to my attention something that I certainly didn't know, and that is the connection between Russell's theory of descriptions and the slingshot. And he interprets, he understands Russell as introducing the theory of descriptions as a way of escaping from the slingshot argument. And that may be right for certain very important cases.
But you don't think for the causal case?
I don't see how it directly bears on the case of causality.
Would you mind saying who you are?
Sure. Martin Davies. Donald, I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more on the topic that you were discussing with Peter there about the semantic structure or logical form of sentences where we have a verb and then some kind of adverbial modification. So, John danced gracefully. So, Peter was making the point that so far as validating the inference from John danced gracefully to so John danced, as far as that goes, there might be no very good motivation to regiment the sentence into the form that you suggest, where it involves quantification over events. But there was another project which you were involved with when you offered that regimentation, which was the project of revealing how the meaning of that whole sentence depended upon the meanings of its parts. And one of the parts is, on the face of it, a predicate, and you might think that it's just a predicate of, say, agents and perhaps times, that the verb is just a predicate of agents and times. And so you might set about trying to show how the meaning or the truth conditions of the whole sentence, John danced gracefully, depended upon just the reference of the term John, and then say the extension of this predicate conceived of as a predicate of agents and times, plus some property or other, some semantic value or other awarded to the adverb. But I thought that there were arguments for saying that that couldn't be done, and I thought those were the real arguments for preferring the regimentation that you offer.
Good, but I don't see them as separate. They sound separate, but in fact, doing one, that is, showing that the inference is valid, and doing the other, showing how the meaning of the sentence depends, or let's say the truth conditions of the sentence depend upon the semantic properties of the parts, those are not two different enterprises, they're the same. I mean, there's still another way of putting it. Try to give the semantics of these sentences, and the most natural thing that you'll come out with is something I think Sellers came out with, and in fact quite a number of people did, which gives you an infinite primitive vocabulary. And that seems unacceptable, both intuitively. Intuitively, obviously, we understand these sentences on the basis of understanding the parts. We don't learn an infinite number of predicates like danced gracefully and danced, as if they were two separate pieces of vocabulary. And so there's this pressure to get the vocabulary down to a finite list, which is, again, just another way of saying we know to begin with that we understand the sentence on the basis of more or less understanding these words, and if we can't show why that's the case, there's something we haven't clarified for ourselves, or as philosophers, let's say, not something ordinary people need at all. But we'd like to know what's going on and why it goes on the way it does. So you're certainly right in adding these ways of expressing the urge to have a formal semantics that you can set out.
I wonder if I can take it just a step further. You said that these two projects are not really distinct, but as I understood it, if we consider the first project of, so to speak, inference underwriting, you more or less agreed that one could do something towards that project while still holding to the sort of form that Peter favours, which is the agent-verb-modifier form. One would have to go beyond syntax to be sure, but one might say for any verb V and modifier M, the things that V Emily are a subset of the things that V. That's not purely syntactic, that's a semantic claim. And that semantic claim would actually underwrite the detachment. So, so far, we can go with the inference underwriting without having to take the further step of regimenting. But I think that you and I agree that the derivation of truth conditions in a systematic way, that can't be done without taking that further step. So if one project can be done without taking the further step and the other can't, then I'm not so sure that they are just the same project, just two views of the same thing.
I'm not sure I've actually got the alternative suggestion, but there are others. I mean, Montague's semantics, for example, do it a completely different way by rising through the set theoretical hierarchy, and the objections to that are of a different sort in turn. I mean, you can get a truth definition and so forth. Montague thought also that was what you needed to do, but he was willing to bring in some extremely high-powered stuff so that when you gave the truth conditions for these sentences, you'd find all sorts of concepts from set theory in the explanation of the semantics that weren't in the original sentence at all. So the sentences didn't come out like Tarski's T sentences, where it's not evident that there are any resources on the right-hand side of the if and only if that aren't already contained in the sentence that's being mentioned. And that seems a highly desirable feature. But I think that we take the first thing on Davidson.
Okay. Mark, have you got a question? Yeah.
Mark Sainsbury, it's a question for Donald Davidson. It's just a little question of detail. One of the things I liked about your proposal about action sentences is that it explains how the word it functions in certain contexts. So, John kissed Mary, it happened in the ballroom.
Right. This is Klein's point exactly.
Right, so that's nice. The problem is that there seems to be some data in very closely related areas that don't quite fit with this. And I just wondered whether you'd got a story about why they don't. For example, if you get a conjunction of existential quantifications, like there was a man at the bus stop and there was a woman at the bus stop, full stop, you can happily go on, they were both French. But it may just be a trivial matter of idiom, but you seem not to be able happily to go on from John kissed Susan and Susan kissed Jack, full stop. They happened in the ballroom. And yet it would seem that on your theory one would predict that you could get the word they to function in that way, to pick up as something bound by the existential quantifiers. It may be a quite insignificant issue, but I just wondered whether you had something to offer us.
No, I don't have much wisdom. It's a tricky and interesting subject of how you pick up references in subsequent sentences that seem to pick up the right thing. And linguists have certainly a lot of examples of problems there. I don't really have very many thoughts. Indexical elements, I think, play a role, but I haven't got a developed theory about how. Maybe there can't be one. I mean, I'm not quite certain about it.
The more general question was, whether you're worried by the fact of the character of attributive adjectives. It's something that comes up particularly in your account of action sentences, because it turns out, as you yourself have noted, that although one might at first sight see your theory as an attempt to reduce adverbial modification to adjectival modification, the kind of adjectival modification you get isn't the kind that we all know and love, the predicative kind, but tends very often to be, in a surprisingly high proportion of cases, to be predicative. So I wonder, this maybe shows some ignorance of something you've written, but I wondered whether that was a question, the nature of predicative adjectival modification was something that you had addressed.
It's kept me awake many a night. We have the same problem both in the case of events and objects. Of course, I've run through the attempted solutions. None of them seems to me to be very good, and it's one of those cases where you have to say, maybe the machinery we're using isn't enough, but I'm still hoping for something simple